Case 1. Redonda Vaught. The case that changed how the American legal system treats medical error inside a hospital began with two vials that looked nothing alike, and a nurse who did not stop to check. On December 26, 2017, at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, a registered nurse named Redonda Vaught was asked to retrieve a sedative called Versed for a patient scheduled for a scan. The patient was Charlene Murphy, a 75-year-old woman from Gallatin, Tennessee, who had been admitted to the neurological intensive care unit 2 days earlier after a brain bleed. By the time of the requested sedative, Murphy's condition was improving. She was being prepared for discharge. Vaught went to the hospital's automated medication dispensing cabinet. According to courtroom testimony, the cabinet's system was slow to locate Versed under its brand name, so Vaught overrode the safety search function and typed in the first two letters, V-E. The cabinet returned a different drug, vecuronium, a paralyzing agent used during surgery to stop patients from moving or breathing on their own during intubation. Vaught retrieved it, did not read the label fully, did not notice a printed warning on the vial's cap, and administered it to Murphy. She then left the area without remaining to observe for an adverse reaction, according to testimony presented at trial. Murphy stopped breathing. She was later declared brain dead and died the following day, December 27, 2017. For nearly a year, this death was not treated as a criminal matter. Vanderbilt University Medical Center reported it internally, and a civil settlement with the Murphy family was reached in 2018. According to later reporting, the hospital did not report the death to state or federal regulators as required. It was only after an anonymous tip reached federal investigators that the case was reopened as a possible crime. That tip triggered a Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services investigation, which in turn brought in the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Investigators reconstructed the timeline using the hospital's own electronic records, the medication cabinet's override logs, the timestamps of Vaught's cabinet withdrawal, and the nursing documentation from that shift. The gap between the moment Vaught pulled the vial and the moment she should have caught her error became the center of the state's case. In September of 2019, Redonda Vaught was arrested and charged with reckless homicide and impaired adult abuse, later refined to gross neglect of an impaired adult. She pleaded not guilty, and the case moved toward trial, delayed in part by the COVID-19 pandemic. Vaught's trial opened in Davidson County Criminal Court in March of 2022, presided over by Judge Jennifer Smith. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Chadwick Jackson, argued that Vaught bypassed at least 5 separate safety checks that should have stopped the error. She overrode the cabinet's search safeguard. She did not notice that vecuronium is a powder requiring reconstitution, while Versed is a liquid. She missed a printed warning on the vial. She did not scan the medication against the patient's wristband because no working scanner was available in the imaging suite, and she did not stay to monitor the patient afterward. The defense, led by attorney Peter Strianze, did not dispute that Vaught made an error. Instead, the defense argued that an honest, reported mistake made under real hospital conditions should not be treated as a criminal act. Witnesses for the defense, including nurse educator Leanna Kraft, testified that overriding the cabinet system was common practice among nurses at the time because a recent update to the hospital's electronic records system had created delays in retrieving medications through the normal process. The defense argued Vanderbilt's own systemic failures, not one nurse's carelessness alone, created the conditions for the error. On March 25, 2022, the jury returned its verdict, not guilty of reckless homicide, but guilty of the lesser-included charge of criminally negligent homicide, and guilty of gross neglect of an impaired adult. At sentencing on May 13, 2022, hundreds of nurses and healthcare workers gathered outside the Nashville courthouse, some having traveled from other states, to protest what they viewed as the criminalization of an honest medical error. Michael Murphy, the victim's son, testified that his family remained affected by his mother's death, though he indicated his mother herself would likely not have wanted a harsh sentence. His father, he said, wanted the maximum penalty. Judge Smith granted Vaught judicial diversion, 3 years of supervised probation, with the conviction eligible for expungement if she completed the term without incident. She received no prison time. Separately, the Tennessee Board of Nursing had already revoked Vaught's nursing license in 2021, citing unprofessional conduct, neglect of a patient requiring care, and failure to maintain an accurate patient record, since Vaught had not properly documented the error at the time it occurred. The Vaught case is widely cited in nursing education and hospital policy discussions because of what changed afterward. Many hospitals, including Vanderbilt, updated medication administration protocols, including requiring wristband barcode scanning at every point a patient receives medication, closing the loophole that existed in the imaging department in 2017. The case also became a flashpoint in an ongoing national debate. Should a documented, reported medical error, absent intent to harm, ever result in a homicide charge against an individual clinician, or does that approach discourage the honest reporting that patient safety systems depend on? The American Nurses Association and the American Hospital Association both issued statements after the verdict expressing concern that criminal prosecution of medical error could make hospitals less safe by discouraging disclosure. Redonda Vaught has since spoken publicly at nursing conferences about patient safety and medication error prevention. She no longer holds a nursing license and has stated she does not intend to return to direct patient care. This case remains the most closely examined nurse-related criminal prosecution in Tennessee history, and it sets the stage for the broader pattern we'll examine throughout this documentary: how investigators reconstruct what happened inside a hospital, one record at a time. Case 2. John A. Stevenson. An artificial intelligence system built specifically to catch this kind of theft was running the entire time. It caught almost nothing. At Erlanger Baroness Hospital in Chattanooga, the largest hospital in the city, a certified registered nurse anesthetist named John Stevenson worked in the surgery center administering anesthesia during operations. Part of his role involved handling fentanyl, a powerful opioid painkiller, before and after procedures. Surgical teams routinely have leftover, or waste, medication after a procedure that must be documented and disposed of according to strict protocol. According to a Tennessee Board of Nursing consent order later made public, Stevenson began diverting unused fentanyl in March of 2025, initially using it once or twice per week. By June of that year, according to his own admission to investigators, his use had escalated to daily buzz. On June 30th, 2025, coworkers in the surgery center noticed Stevenson was behaving unusually while on duty. The Board of Nursing order describes what they observed in specific terms: slurred speech, extreme fatigue, standing with his eyes closed and swaying, head nodding while upright, and visible difficulty staying awake. Colleagues reported this to hospital leadership. Stevenson was given a drug test the following day, which returned positive for fentanyl and its metabolite, norfentanyl. He was terminated from his position. What makes this case unusual, and what drew national attention to it, is what happened next. Erlanger, like hundreds of hospitals across the country, used an artificial intelligence-powered monitoring platform called Sentry 7, made by the healthcare technology company Wolters Kluwer, specifically designed to detect irregular patterns in controlled substance dispensing that indicate diversion. The system is used at roughly 700 hospitals nationwide as a safeguard against exactly this kind of theft. When Erlanger's drug diversion specialist went back and manually audited 4 months of Stevenson's dispensing records following his positive drug test, the audit found approximately 5 separate instances where fentanyl waste did not match what should have been documented, discrepancies the automated software had not flagged. In the Board of Nursing's own language, the software was described as being in its initial learning phase at the time, which may have contributed to the gap. A drug diversion industry expert, Terry Vitals of Our Expert Solutions, was quoted afterward, questioning that explanation directly, stating that catching a discrepancy of this kind is the most basics of basics for this type of monitoring software, and raising the possibility that human error in configuring or monitoring the system, not a technical failure, was the more likely cause for the Tennessee Department of Health. When investigators interviewed Stevenson in September of 2025, he admitted to the pattern of diversion described above. He signed a consent order with the Tennessee Board of Nursing in November of 2025. The Department of Health released the order publicly in December as part of its routine disclosure of professional disciplinary actions. Under the terms of the consent order, Stevenson's advanced practice registered nurse certification and his underlying registered nurse license were suspended, later moving to a probationary status, with mandatory substance abuse counseling and monitoring as conditions of any future practice. His multi-state nursing license privilege, which would have allowed him to practice in other states under an interstate compact, was deactivated. No criminal charges were filed in connection with this matter. The case was resolved entirely through the state's professional licensing process rather than in criminal court. The Stevenson case is significant less for the scale of the diversion and more for what it revealed about the limits of automated safeguards. Hospitals across the country have invested heavily in AI-based diversion detection as a frontline defense against exactly the pattern Stevenson exhibited: a clinician quietly siphoning off small, individually unremarkable quantities of a controlled substance over an extended period. The Erlanger case demonstrated that such systems are not a substitute for direct observation by colleagues. It was Stevenson's coworkers, not the software, who ultimately identified the problem through direct observation of physical impairment during a shift. The subsequent manual audit, conducted by a trained human specialist, reviewing the same data the AI system had access to, caught what the automated system had missed. This case is frequently cited in ongoing discussions among hospital administrators and health policy researchers about how much confidence institutions should place in algorithmic monitoring systems for controlled substances, and about the continued necessity of a culture where coworkers feel able to report signs of impairment without hesitation. It is also a reminder that drug diversion cases do not always end in criminal prosecution. State licensing boards operate as a parallel system of accountability, one focused on removing a practitioner's ability to access controlled substances and patients, rather than on punishment through the criminal courts. Case 3. Laurel Beth Gallion. This case began not with a hospital audit or a coworker's report, but with a routine referral from a state welfare agency, one line in a much larger system, built to catch exactly this kind of theft. Laurel Beth Gallion, a licensed practical nurse from La Vergne, Tennessee, worked at a healthcare facility in Murfreesboro, in Rutherford County. According to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, Gallion was found to have stolen hydrocodone, an opioid painkiller, that had been prescribed specifically for a patient in her care. The case began in July of 2022, when the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's Medicaid Fraud Control Division received information from the Tennessee Department of Human Services. This division of the TBI exists specifically to investigate abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation of patients in healthcare settings, particularly where those patients receive care funded through Medicaid. It operates as one of the primary mechanisms through which patient harm cases involving licensed medical professionals in Tennessee come to light, since individual patients, especially those who are elderly, sedated, or cognitively impaired, are often not in a position to report theft or abuse themselves. Investigators reviewed medication administration records at the Murfreesboro facility, cross-referencing what was documented as given to the patient against what had actually been withdrawn from the facility's controlled substance stock. Hydrocodone, like other opioid medications, is subject to strict chain-of-custody documentation requirements precisely because of its abuse potential and its street value. Any discrepancy between what a facility's records show was dispensed and what a patient's chart shows was administered creates an investigative trail that a trained auditor working alongside law enforcement can follow. The investigation led to a formal presentation of evidence to a Rutherford County grand jury, which returned an indictment on February 8, 2023, charging Gallion with one count of theft. She was arrested on August 24th of that year and processed at the Rutherford County Jail on a bond of $5,000. Public court records reviewed for this documentary do not indicate the final disposition of this case, meaning whether Gallion entered a plea, went to trial, or received a specific sentence. This is worth stating plainly, because a documentary that deals in verified fact rather than assumption, should never fill in gaps in the public record with speculation. What is confirmed through Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and county court records is the indictment itself and the specific charge. What this case illustrates, even without a documented final outcome, is the mechanism by which most drug theft cases involving nurses in Tennessee actually surface. It is rarely a dramatic discovery. It is far more often the product of a documentation mismatch, caught during a routine audit or flagged by an unrelated agency, then handed to a specialized investigative division built for this exact purpose. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's Medicaid Fraud Control Division works in close coordination with Adult Protective Services and the Department of Human Services, meaning tips about possible exploitation or theft involving a vulnerable patient can originate from multiple directions: a nursing home inspector, a pharmacy audit, a family member's complaint, or a state welfare caseworker noticing something in an unrelated review. For patients receiving long-term or hospice-level care, particularly elderly patients on opioid pain management, this kind of documentation-based detection is often the only realistic safeguard against theft, since the patients themselves may be too medically compromised to notice or report that their prescribed pain relief is not reaching them as intended. This is a pattern we will see repeated, with variations, throughout the rest of this documentary. Cases uncovered not through a single dramatic event, but through the quiet, procedural work of comparing what should have happened against what the records show actually did. Case 4. Everett Collier Reagan. Note on this case: at the time of this recording, the charges described below are pending in court. Under Tennessee and United States law, a person is presumed innocent until proven guilty, and nothing in this segment should be understood as a statement of guilt. A travel nurse works one contract, then vanishes to the next state before anyone can look too closely at what he left behind. That, according to investigators, was the ongoing operating pattern behind this case, until it finally caught up with him roughly a year later, in a different city altogether. Everett Collier Reagan worked as a travel nurse, meaning he was contracted through an agency to fill short-term staffing gaps at hospitals, rather than being a permanent employee of any single facility. He was placed at Bristol Regional Medical Center, part of the Ballad Health System in Bristol, Tennessee, located in Sullivan County, in the northeastern corner of the state. According to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, Ballad Health referred concerns about Reagan's conduct to state investigators in April of 2025. The referral fell to the TBI's Medicaid Fraud Control Division and its Drug Investigation Division, working jointly, a common pairing in cases that involve both patient neglect and suspected controlled substance fraud. Investigators examined dispensing and administration records tied to Reagan's patient assignments, looking specifically for evidence that pain medication intended for a vulnerable adult patient had been diverted rather than administered as documented. Because Reagan worked as a contracted travel nurse rather than a direct hospital employee, investigators also had to coordinate across multiple layers of employment records, the staffing agency's files, and the hospital's own internal systems to build a complete timeline. The case moved through the investigative process over roughly a year. In March of 2026, a Sullivan County grand jury returned an indictment. By that point, Reagan was no longer in the area. Investigators located him in Nashville, more than 200 miles from Bristol, and he was arrested in early April of 2026 with assistance from the Metro Nashville Police Department. Reagan faces 2 counts of neglect of a vulnerable adult and 3 counts of prescription drug fraud. As of this recording, the case remains pending, with no trial date confirmed and public records reviewed for this documentary. This case highlights a structural challenge specific to travel and agency nursing, a segment of the healthcare workforce that expanded significantly following staffing shortages during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. Travel nurses move between facilities and often between states on short-term contracts, sometimes lasting only a matter of weeks. This mobility, while valuable for hospitals facing acute staffing gaps, can also create gaps in institutional memory. A facility that employs a travel nurse for a brief assignment may not retain the same depth of oversight, familiarity, or long-term pattern recognition that develops with a permanent staff member over years. Ballad Health's decision to refer Reagan's case to state investigators and the roughly year-long process that followed before an indictment and an out-of-state arrest illustrates how thoroughly these investigations must be built when the person under scrutiny is not tied to a single, fixed workplace. Prescription drug fraud charges in particular require investigators to establish a documented pattern, not an isolated incident, which means pulling records across every date the nurse worked, matching them against pharmacy logs, and identifying discrepancies that could not be explained by ordinary clinical variation. This case remains open, and any conclusions about guilt or innocence rest entirely with the court. What is documented is the referral, the joint TBI investigation, the grand jury indictment, and the arrest. We will follow this case for updates as it proceeds through the Sullivan County court system. Case 5. Joseph Juzak. Note on this case, the charge described below is pending in court. The defendant is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty. He was not assigned to care for this patient at all. According to a state disciplinary report, that is precisely what made his presence in the room, and what he was seen doing there, impossible for a colleague to ignore. Joseph Juzak worked as a registered nurse in the intensive care unit at Holston Valley Medical Center in Kingsport, part of Sullivan County in northeastern Tennessee. According to a Tennessee Department of Health disciplinary report, an incident in September of 2024 led to a formal state investigation into his conduct. According to the disciplinary report, Juzak was observed using a syringe to extract Versed, the sedative midazolam, from the intravenous bag of a patient who was not under his assigned care. When confronted about this at the time, he refused to submit to a drug screen. A more detailed consent order signed in May of 2025 expands on the sequence of events. According to that order, Juzak first asked a colleague whether any of her assigned patients were currently receiving Versed. When told that one patient's Versed drip had been paused, he entered that patient's room. A witness reported observing him drawing the medication from the IV bag using a syringe. Juzak later stated, according to the order, that his intention had been to administer the drug to his own assigned patient, after an order for Versed for that patient had reportedly been rejected through the normal channel. Following the Department of Health's disciplinary report in July of 2025, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation opened a criminal investigation at the specific request of Barry Staubus, the District Attorney General for Tennessee's 2nd Judicial District, which covers Sullivan County. This request illustrates an important distinction in how these cases proceed. A nursing board disciplinary finding and a criminal charge are two separate legal tracks, and a district attorney can request a criminal investigation into conduct that a licensing board has already reviewed administratively. In late March of 2026, a Sullivan County grand jury returned an indictment against Juzak on one count of prescription drug fraud. He turned himself in on March 27th and was released on a bond of $12,500. As of this recording, the case remains pending in Sullivan County Court. This case is a clear illustration of how a nurse accessing medication for a patient not assigned to their care, even with a stated clinical justification, triggers an immediate red flag under hospital protocol and state law. Medication administration in a modern hospital operates on a strict principle, sometimes summarized as the 5 rights: the right patient, the right drug, the right dose, the right route, and the right time, verified against a specific physician's order for that specific patient. A nurse retrieving a controlled substance from a bag belonging to a different patient, regardless of stated intent, bypasses every one of those verification points simultaneously. The involvement of both the Tennessee Department of Health's disciplinary process and a separately requested TBI criminal investigation also demonstrates how these two systems, administrative licensing oversight and criminal prosecution, can operate in parallel rather than as substitutes for one another. A nurse can face license suspension through a board consent order while simultaneously facing a separate criminal indictment for the same underlying conduct, prosecuted under an entirely different legal standard and burden of proof. This case remains open. We will provide updates as the Sullivan County proceedings continue. Case 6. Bailey K. Sullivan. 130 separate instances, nearly 500 individual pills or medication units, more than 20 different drug types. And by the time a hospital audit brought all of that into focus, the pattern had been building for years inside a hospital system that treats children. Bailey K. Sullivan worked as a registered nurse within the Methodist Le Bonheur healthcare system in Memphis, Shelby County, a system that includes a well-known children's hospital. According to a Tennessee Board of Nursing order, Sullivan was employed within this system from 2016 through 2019. With the period of greatest concern identified as the first 2 weeks of July in 2019. The case came to light through an internal hospital audit at Methodist University Hospital, a facility within the same healthcare system. According to the Board of Nursing's order, that audit identified 130 separate instances in which the administration or disposal of controlled substances had not been properly documented, spanning more than 20 distinct medication types and totaling nearly 500 individual pills or medication units. This kind of audit works by comparing three separate data points that should always align: what a physician's order authorized, what the automated dispensing cabinet recorded as withdrawn, and what the patient's chart documents as actually administered, or, in the case of any unused portion, properly witnessed and disposed of by a second clinician. When a nurse withdraws a controlled substance and the corresponding administration or disposal documentation is missing, incomplete, or inconsistent across a large enough sample, it becomes a pattern that auditors are specifically trained to identify. When confronted with the audit findings, Sullivan admitted to a substance use disorder. According to the Board of Nursing's order, she stated that some of the medications in question had been used by her personally while she was on duty, and she acknowledged understanding that working while impaired created a risk of harm to the patients under her care. This case was resolved entirely through Tennessee's professional licensing system, rather than through criminal prosecution. The Tennessee Board of Nursing, acting through the Tennessee Department of Health, suspended Sullivan's nursing license. Under the terms of that action, reinstatement requires a minimum of 3 years of probation, along with a formal substance use evaluation and ongoing monitoring. Public records reviewed for this documentary do not indicate that criminal charges were filed in connection with this matter. This case is one of the clearest examples in this documentary of how routine, internal hospital auditing, not a single dramatic incident, is often the mechanism that surfaces a long-running pattern of diversion. 130 documentation gaps across multiple years did not emerge from a single red flag. They emerged from a systematic review of records that most patients, and most of the public, never see. The three-way reconciliation between physician order, automated cabinet withdrawal, and nursing documentation that every hospital is required to maintain for every controlled substance. The case also illustrates the distinction, seen elsewhere in this documentary, between administrative and criminal accountability. Sullivan's license suspension removed her ability to access controlled substances or provide direct patient care, the primary safety concern in a diversion case of this scale, without the matter necessarily proceeding through a criminal court. Whether a diversion case results in criminal charges, an administrative license action, or both often depends on factors including the specific substances involved, whether any patient can be shown to have suffered direct harm as a result, and prosecutorial discretion in the relevant judicial district. This case, occurring within a system that includes pediatric care, also underscores why hospital-wide auditing systems exist, independent of any single incident report. The patients most affected by a diversion pattern like this one are often the least able to identify or report it themselves. Case 7. Heather Marks. Nearly 1 million opioid pills, prescribed by one person at one small clinic over less than 2 years. This is not an estimate or a rounded figure for dramatic effect. It is the number a federal jury heard directly from prosecutors and ultimately accepted as fact when it returned its verdict. Heather Marks worked as an advanced practice registered nurse, specifically a nurse practitioner licensed by the Drug Enforcement Administration to prescribe controlled substances, at a clinic called Life Force Pain and Wellness in Carthage, Smith County, Tennessee. According to the United States Department of Justice, between September of 2016 and May of 2018, Marks personally prescribed nearly 1 million opioid pills, primarily oxycodone and oxymorphone, to almost 1,000 patients of the Life Force Clinic. Prosecutors presented evidence that many of these patients displayed clear, observable signs of drug misuse, including signs consistent with active addiction or the resale of prescribed medication, at the very time Marks was writing new prescriptions for them. The Department of Justice stated plainly in its own summary of the case that Marks ignored obvious signs of Life Force patients taking illegal drugs at the time she prescribed them opioids, which put these patients in danger of overdosing. This case was investigated jointly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Office of Inspector General for the United States Department of Health and Human Services, and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. This kind of multi-agency structure is typical for what are commonly called pill mill investigations, clinics that use a legitimate medical license as cover for what functions, in practice, as a high-volume prescription drug distribution operation. Investigators in these cases typically build their evidence through prescription monitoring database records, which track every controlled substance prescription filled at a pharmacy against the prescriber and patient involved, alongside financial records, patient interviews, and, where available, undercover visits to the clinic itself. Marks was indicted in 2019 as part of a broader regional law enforcement operation targeting opioid overprescription across the region. Her case proceeded to a federal jury trial in the United States District Court for the Middle District of Tennessee. On June 1, 2026, a federal jury convicted Marks of conspiracy to illegally distribute controlled substances, along with 8 separate counts of illegal distribution. Each count carries a maximum possible sentence of 20 years in federal prison. Her sentencing hearing is scheduled for September 1, 2026, and as of this recording, the specific sentence has not yet been handed down. The case was prosecuted by the Department of Justice's Criminal Division, Fraud Section, with Assistant Chief Jim Hayes and trial attorneys Lauren Randell and Manu Sebastian handling the prosecution. The Marks case illustrates the scale that opioid overprescription cases can reach when a single licensed prescriber operates largely without effective internal oversight. Unlike drug diversion cases, where a nurse steals medication meant for someone else, this is a prescribing case. The medication was, on paper, legitimately ordered for the patient whose name appeared on it. The crime lies in the prescriber's documented pattern of ignoring clear evidence of misuse and continuing to authorize dangerous quantities of opioids regardless. This distinction matters for how these cases are investigated and prosecuted. Diversion cases are typically built from dispensing cabinet logs and chain of custody documentation inside a single facility. Prescribing cases like this one are built primarily from state and federal prescription monitoring databases that track patterns across an entire prescriber's practice over months or years, allowing investigators to demonstrate that the volume, frequency, and pattern of prescriptions fell so far outside accepted medical practice that it could not be explained by legitimate patient need. The nearly 1 million pill figure at the center of this case did not come from a single chart. It came from cross-referencing pharmacy fill records against Marks's own prescribing history across almost 1,000 separate patients, over nearly 2 full years. Case 8. Cynthia Clemens, Courtney Newman, and Holly Carmichael Womack. More than 11 million pills, over $21 million in clinic revenue, an estimated street value approaching $360 million. 3 nurse practitioners were convicted for their roles inside this operation, and their case connects directly to one of the largest pill mill prosecutions in East Tennessee history. Cynthia Clemens, Courtney Newman, and Holly Carmichael Womack were nurse practitioners working within a network of clinics in the Knoxville area, in Knox County, Tennessee. These clinics were tied to a larger operation run by Sylvia Hofstetter, who was separately convicted of racketeering, drug conspiracy, and money laundering in connection with the same network. According to the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Tennessee, the clinics involved in this operation distributed more than 11 million tablets of oxycodone, oxymorphone, and morphine. The operation generated more than $21 million in clinic revenue, an amount prosecutors said corresponded to an estimated street value of approximately $360 million once resold illegally. This case was built by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, working under the direction of Special Agent in Charge Joseph Carrico and United States Attorney J. Douglas Overbay. As with the Marks case, the investigation relied heavily on prescription monitoring data to establish patterns of prescribing that far exceeded any plausible legitimate medical purpose, alongside financial records tracing the clinic's revenue and internal clinic documentation. A jury convicted all 3 nurse practitioners on February 13, 2020. Cynthia Clemens was convicted on 2 counts of maintaining drug-involved premises. Courtney Newman and Holly Carmichael Womack were each convicted on 1 count of the same charge. Notably, all 3 defendants were acquitted of several additional charges brought against them, including specific counts related to writing opioid prescriptions directly, indicating the jury drew a careful distinction between operating or maintaining a facility used for illegal drug distribution and directly authoring the prescriptions themselves. United States District Judge Thomas A. Varlin sentenced the 3 defendants over 2 days, December 9th and 10th, 2020. Clemens received a sentence of 42 months in federal prison. Newman received 40 months. Womack received 30 months. This case demonstrates how federal prosecutors approach pill mill operations that involve multiple licensed professionals working within the same clinic network, rather than a single individual prescriber acting alone. The charge of maintaining drug-involved premises, distinct from a direct prescribing charge, allowed prosecutors to hold Clemens, Newman, and Womack accountable for their role in operating a facility that functioned as a drug distribution point, even where the jury found the evidence insufficient to convict on every individual prescription-related count. The scale of this operation, more than 11 million pills moving through a small number of East Tennessee clinics, illustrates why federal, rather than state authorities, typically lead pill mill investigations of this size. The Drug Enforcement Administration's prescription tracking infrastructure, combined with the Internal Revenue Service and Federal Bureau of Investigation's financial forensic capabilities, allows investigators to trace patient volume, pill counts, and clinic revenue across an operation spanning multiple locations and multiple licensed prescribers simultaneously, building a single, unified case rather than pursuing each clinic or each prescriber in isolation. This connected, network-level approach to investigation is what ultimately tied Clemens, Newman, and Womack's individual conduct to the much larger Hofstadter organization and secured convictions against all three. Case 9. Tyler Butcher. Note on this case, the charges described below are pending. The defendant is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in a court of law. This documentary does not state or imply guilt. An arrest at a private residence, 4 separate criminal charges, and a hospital that terminated the accused before the legal process had even reached its earliest stage. This case, still working through Tennessee's court system, involves the most serious category of allegation in this documentary, an alleged assault against a patient. Tyler Butcher, a 25-year-old nurse, worked at Ascension St. Thomas Rutherford Hospital in Murfreesboro, Rutherford County, Tennessee. According to the Murfreesboro Police Department, an investigation was opened into an allegation that Butcher sexually assaulted a patient while on duty at the hospital. Following that investigation, Butcher was arrested at his home on December 5, 2025, and was released on a bond of $14,000. Ascension St. Thomas terminated Butcher's employment following his arrest. Butcher faces 4 separate charges: kidnapping, sexual battery, prevention of emergency services, and indecent exposure. A hearing in Rutherford County General Sessions Court was set for February 5, 2026. As of this recording, this case remains active and unresolved in the Tennessee court system, and no verdict has been reached. We are including this case specifically to demonstrate an important and necessary distinction that runs throughout responsible legal reporting: the difference between an arrest and a conviction. Every case discussed earlier in this documentary that reached a verdict, whether a conviction or an acquittal, was reported here only after that verdict was reached. This case has not yet reached that point. Under the constitutions of both Tennessee and the United States, a person facing criminal charges retains the presumption of innocence at every stage of the process, up to and including the reading of a verdict. What is documented and verifiable at this stage is limited to the fact of the police investigation, the specific charges filed, the arrest, the bond amount, and the scheduled court hearing. The underlying allegations themselves are, at this point, exactly that: allegations which the prosecution will be required to prove beyond a reasonable doubt if the case proceeds to trial, and which the defense is entitled to contest fully. Cases involving allegations against a hospital patient present unique investigative challenges compared to the diversion and prescribing cases discussed earlier in this documentary. Diversion cases can often be substantiated primarily through documentation, cabinet logs, drug tests, financial records, independent of witness testimony. Allegations of assault typically depend far more heavily on witness accounts, any available physical evidence, hospital security footage where it exists, and the credibility determinations a jury alone is empowered to make. This is precisely why the legal system requires the full trial process to run its course before any conclusion is drawn, and why we are presenting only the confirmed procedural facts of this case, rather than any characterization of what may or may not have occurred. We will provide an update on this case if and when it reaches a resolution in Rutherford County Court. Case 10. Candace Booker. A note before this final case. Candace Booker worked as a certified nurse aide, a role that assists directly with patient care, but is licensed and regulated differently from a registered nurse, licensed practical nurse, or nurse practitioner. We include this case because it involves direct financial exploitation of a patient, and because it illustrates a category of harm distinct from every other case in this documentary. An elderly patient's own bank card, used for purchases the patient never authorized, at a business within walking distance of the facility where she was supposed to be receiving care. Candace Booker, age 39 at the time of her arrest, of Nashville, Tennessee, worked at a rehabilitation center in Murfreesboro, Rutherford County. In August of 2020, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation received information through Adult Protective Services indicating that an elderly resident's bank card had been used without her authorization. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's Medicaid Fraud Control Division opened an investigation in coordination with the Murfreesboro Police Department. Investigators traced the unauthorized card transactions to a specific nearby business and, through transaction records and surveillance footage typically maintained by retail locations, connected the purchases to Booker. This type of financial exploitation case, involving an elderly or otherwise vulnerable patient's financial accounts, follows an investigative pattern distinct from the drug-related cases examined earlier in this documentary. Rather than pharmacy and medication records, the evidentiary trail runs through bank statements, card transaction logs, and point-of-sale records, cross-referenced against a facility's staff schedules to establish who had access to the resident and her belongings at the relevant times. Booker was arrested by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation on June 11th. She was charged with 2 counts of theft, 2 counts of fraudulent use of a credit or debit card, and 1 count of exploitation of a vulnerable or elderly person. This case closes our documentary on a category of harm that receives far less public attention than drug diversion, prescription fraud, or physical assault, but that state investigators describe as a persistent and serious problem within long-term care and rehabilitation settings. Financial exploitation of patients who may have limited ability to monitor their own accounts, question unfamiliar transactions, or in some cases, communicate that anything is wrong at all. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation maintains a public Tennessee abuse registry, specifically because financial exploitation, along with physical and emotional abuse and neglect, of adults age 70 and older, or of adults with physical or mental conditions that leave them vulnerable regardless of age, is recognized under Tennessee law as a distinct and serious category of elder abuse. The investigative partnership between the TBI's Medicaid Fraud Control Division and Adult Protective Services that led to Booker's arrest reflects a broader, ongoing coordination between state welfare agencies and law enforcement. One built specifically around the recognition that patients in long-term care settings often depend entirely on outside observers, a caseworker, an auditor, a family member reviewing a bank statement, to notice when something has gone wrong, because they frequently cannot report it themselves. 10 cases, 10 different points of failure, caught by 10 different combinations of hospital audits, coworker reports, licensing board investigations, prescription monitoring databases, and dedicated state investigative units built specifically for this purpose. Some of these cases ended in conviction. Some ended in license suspension without criminal charges. Some remain open today, moving through the Tennessee court system as this video is published. What connects them is not any single method of detection, but the layered system built around modern healthcare specifically to catch what one layer alone might miss. The coworker who notices impaired behavior, the auditor who notices a documentation gap, the database that flags an unusual prescribing pattern, the licensing board that can act even when a criminal charge is not pursued. If this investigation was useful to you, tap the like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Hidden Case Diaries for more researched, source-verified case reviews.